Hey, I'm Andy Slade. I'm here today with Corbin from Oryx Chassis, and we're going to be talking about our fundamentals of marksmanship. This is the continuation of our series on fundamentals, and today we're going to be talking about sight alignment. So traditional sight alignment with, like, say, iron sights was when we had the front sight post centered in that rear sight, so you had equal height and equal light. Or if you had a peep sight, the front sight was centered in that peep sight, right in the center of that rear peep. But we've obviously got a magnified optic now, so there's two things that I think directly apply to sight alignment when we're using a magnified optic. One is your scope level, and the other is parallax. So we'll talk about them individually. So your scope level is important because we have a slight offset with the aiming device being higher than our center of bore. So what we're going to want to do is make sure that when we set our scope up, we made sure that the bubble was level with our reticle. Now when we take our shots, we want to make sure that we check that level so that we're not getting windage when we dial our elevation. Because what will happen is if we cant the system, the projectile is going to come up to meet our line of sight, but if our line of sight is canted, it's going to be off to the left or right by a little bit. So we're going to check our level and make sure that our scope's level, and that's going to make sure that we've got good sight alignment that way. And then the other thing is that we want to make sure we've got our parallax accounted for. Now what parallax is when the target image and the reticle image are on two different planes. And if we perceive those two different planes to be somewhere they're not, that's parallax error. So for example, my target image and my reticle image, if I adjusted the parallax out of it, then we would focus those two planes together onto the same plane. Okay, so now it doesn't matter as much where I put my head because we're actually looking directly onto an image that has the target image and the reticle image focused together. So parallax is super important, especially the more that you zoom in. So the higher zoom level that you use, the more parallax error that we could potentially see. But the best thing to do here is just set the rifle up without touching the rifle, maybe just holding the rear bag. Look through the scope and wiggle your face a little bit, and if you see that reticle move without moving the rifle at all, that's parallax error. So you could have 2 to 4/10 mil of parallax error depending on how bad, you know, your scope shadow is and everything. So if we look through the scope and we see a scope shadow on one side, then we're definitely not looking through that scope straight.
What distance when you're shooting do you think that cant sort of comes into play the most?
Yeah, so cant is more important when we're at, like, say 500 and out. Now it obviously can have some effect closer if it's really canted, but it's best, in my opinion, to put it into your shot process so that you're actually checking it every time, no matter what. Because if you get into the habit of not checking it when you're practicing, say at 400, and then you go out to 800 and you forget to check it, then you're definitely going to have a lot of error. But the more adjustment that we dial into that scope, the more that bullet is going to come up to meet our line of sight, and so that ballistic curve is going to be greater. So when we cant that ballistic curve, it's going to have more error in it.
Now if you're looking through your scope and you know that that reticle is a little bit blurry, or you can have the target a little bit blurry, which one would you rather have?
So we used to have this conversation a lot with iron sights, right? So we wanted to have a clear front sight post, and then the rear sight would be blurry and the target would be blurry. But since we have a magnified optic now, if you see a blurry reticle, we really need to adjust the diopter, and we should do that first. So the diopter is the eyepiece on the scope, and if we don't have the scope properly adjusted from the beginning, then it could induce parallax error into our system. So we want to make sure that before we ever start, before we even zero the rifle, we properly adjust that diopter on your scope. And that's going to make sure that when you dial your parallax knob, you're getting the most out of the scope that you paid for.